He wasn't speeding. He wasn't armed. He wasn't a threat. Just a man pulling over on a quiet city street, trying to avoid trouble. But within minutes, he was pinned to the asphalt, groaning beneath the weight of 4 police officers. They shouted over each other, barking conflicting commands. One reached for a baton. Another deployed a taser. The man, bare-chested, disoriented, scared, kept his hands visible the entire time. He wasn't resisting. But to them, he was already guilty. From a nearby apartment balcony, a man stood frozen, clutching an old camcorder. He watched the scene unfold, watched as one officer delivered the first blow, then another, and another. The baton rose and fell, again and again, cracking against ribs, back, skull. The camera shook as the blows landed, but it didn't stop recording. 81 seconds. That's all it captured. But those 81 seconds would ignite a civil rights firestorm. What was caught on tape wasn't just police brutality. It was a public exposure of racial profiling, abuse of power, and a justice system many had long believed was blind only to the truth. The man on the ground wasn't famous. He wasn't rich. He had no high-profile lawyer or political connection, just a past he was trying to outrun, and a future he never got the chance to reach. What happened to him that night wasn't supposed to matter. Cases like his didn't make national headlines. Not until this one did. Because that shaky handheld video, the kind you'd expect from a birthday party or school recital, ended up on every major news outlet in the country. It was the kind of footage no police report could explain away. No internal affairs statement could spin. It was raw. It was real. And it was horrifying. But what came next was worse. The officers were identified, placed on leave, and charged. There was hope, faint but present, that justice might finally show its face. Communities waited, held vigils, marched peacefully, demanding accountability. And then, the verdict came. Not guilty. Not one conviction. The nation exhaled and then exploded. Because what do you do when even video evidence isn't enough? When does the law protect the ones who break it? This isn't just a story about one man. It's a story about systemic failure, about unchecked authority, about the dangers of implicit bias and police misconduct. It's a story about a camera that told the truth and a courtroom that refused to listen. But what no one expected was what would happen next, when federal investigators stepped in, and the very system that failed was forced to answer. Before that night, he was just another face in the crowd, a working-class man trying to rebuild a life after some bad decisions. He had 2 young daughters he adored and a construction job that barely paid the bills, but kept him going. He wasn't a saint, but he wasn't a danger to anyone. He'd made mistakes run-ins with petty theft, a DUI years back, but lately, he was focused on staying out of trouble. That night, he was driving home after a small get-together. He'd had a drink, maybe 2, but he wasn't swerving, wasn't speeding. What he feared most wasn't crashing, it was getting pulled over. Because he knew the system, and he knew men who looked like him didn't always make it home when blue lights flashed in the rear view. So when he saw the police cruiser behind him, his chest tightened. Not because he'd done anything outrageous, but because he was on probation. Another arrest, even for a minor offense, could mean jail time. He panicked. He pressed the gas, trying to get a little distance, hoping maybe he could buy time to think. He didn't realize the patrol unit had already radioed backup. The officers thought they were chasing a suspect. He was just trying to avoid a ticket. The pursuit wasn't long, but it felt endless. Helicopters joined in. Spike strips were prepared. The media would later say the chase was dangerous, even reckless, but witnesses at the scene told another story. When he finally pulled over near an apartment complex, he stepped out with visible confusion. He didn't charge. He didn't shout. He was overwhelmed, sweaty, and looking for direction. That's when they charged. What happened next would become the most infamous use of force incident caught on tape before the age of smartphones. But back then, recordings weren't common. Police misconduct was often hidden behind closed doors, protected by vague reports and institutional loyalty. This time, however, someone was watching. From his balcony on the second floor, a man named George had been jolted out of bed by the noise. Curious, he grabbed his camcorder. It wasn't high-tech, just a consumer-grade VHS camera, but it captured everything. The baton strikes, the shouts, the commands that overlapped, the stillness of a man on the ground, trying not to die. He filmed in disbelief, whispering under his breath, "They're gonna kill him." Then he rewound the tape and watched it again, twice. What should he do? Was it safe to release it? He didn't know Rodney, didn't know the officers either. But what he did know, as an American citizen, was that something deeply wrong had taken place and that silence would make him complicit. The next morning, George took the tape to a local news station. No big plans, just the belief that someone had to see it. That video aired that same night. Within hours, it was everywhere, broadcast into homes from coast to coast. Families sat in silence, stunned by the brutality. Politicians issued cautious statements. Community leaders called for calm, but couldn't hide their anger. Police departments around the country braced for backlash. But in living rooms, offices, barbershops, and churches, one question kept repeating. If this is what they did on camera, what happens when no one is watching? The LAPD issued a short statement. The incident is under internal review. That was it. No arrests, no suspensions, just bureaucracy. The 4 officers identified in the tape were placed on leave, but not fired. Public trust, already fragile, began to crack. Local residents flooded City Hall with demands for police accountability. Civil rights organizations began organizing protests. Black communities across the country recognized the pattern. This wasn't new. It was just finally visible. What made this case different wasn't just the evidence, it was the undeniable nature of it. You didn't need a law degree to understand what was wrong. You didn't need subtitles or interpretation. The blows were obvious. The screams were real. The silence of the man on the ground, his lack of retaliation, was louder than any justification the officers could offer. As the investigation dragged on, so did the outrage. Every time the video aired, more people took to the streets. Peaceful protests grew larger, louder, and more focused. The phrase "police brutality" became a national headline. Suddenly, terms like racial profiling, use of force, and civil rights violations were on everyone's lips. People were educating themselves. College students held teach-ins. Churches led forums. Even some officers quietly admitted that was too much. But behind closed doors, the mood was different. District attorneys hesitated. The police union pushed back. They argued that the tape didn't show everything that the man might have resisted before the camera started rolling. They said force was necessary to maintain public safety. They insisted that officers had to make split-second decisions. It was the same playbook used time and time again in excessive force cases, only this time, The public wasn't buying it. Eventually, under immense pressure, charges were filed. The officers were indicted on multiple counts of assault and excessive force. The trial was set. The location, not the city where it happened, but a quiet, mostly white suburb known for its calm neighborhoods and retired police officers. Many saw the relocation as a tactical move, a quiet way to protect the outcome. Still, people hoped. After all, they had the tape. How could a jury possibly look at that footage and call it justice? What no one could see coming, at least not yet, was how far the system would go to protect its own. What began as a case about one man's body and 4 officers' rage was quickly becoming something bigger. It was now a test of the entire system. Would the law bend toward justice or crack under the weight of its own history? The trial opened under high security, but behind the courtroom doors, something felt off from the start. The jury was hand-picked from the new location, a quiet suburban community where almost no one looked like the man in the video. Not one black juror. Several were former or related to law enforcement. The defense team didn't deny that the officers had used force. What they argued was that it was justified. Their strategy wasn't to disprove the video, but to reinterpret it, frame by frame. They slowed it down, broke it apart, and narrated it beat by beat. "Look here," one attorney said, pointing to a paused frame. "He lifts his leg. It's a sign of resistance. They claimed he posed a danger, that he was reaching for something, that the strikes were necessary to gain compliance. What they didn't mention was that by the time half the baton blows landed, the man was lying still, no longer moving. No gun, no knife, not even a closed fist, just a body curled on the concrete." Meanwhile, the prosecution focused on the obvious: the number of strikes, the length of the beating, the fact that multiple officers took turns, escalating instead of de-escalating. They brought in medical experts to testify about broken bones, deep tissue damage, and nerve trauma. They showed the video in real time, no edits, no narration, just 81 seconds of raw violence. But even with the evidence, something felt shaky. The prosecutors looked unsure. The judge kept tight control. The defense remained calm, methodical, and precise. And the jury stone-faced. Outside, the city held its breath. Civil rights leaders organized peaceful demonstrations, holding signs that read, "Justice is watching and the tape doesn't lie." News stations debated the role of video evidence in the courtroom. Legal analysts warned that convictions weren't guaranteed. Meanwhile, families watching from living rooms around the country waited, especially black families who had seen this play out too many times before. There were whispers that the officers would walk, and not because they were innocent, but because the system wasn't built to convict them. This wasn't just about excessive force. It was about a larger question: what happens when law enforcement crosses the line, and the very institutions meant to hold them accountable? Look away. The verdict came fast. Not guilty, on all counts. No convictions. The courtroom was quiet, but only for a moment. The city outside was not. Word spread within minutes. Crowds gathered on the streets, not with weapons or violence, but with heartbreak, with disbelief. The video had been real. The injuries had been real. The man's pain had been real. And yet, in the eyes of the court, it wasn't enough. Not enough to punish those who wore the badge. The disbelief didn't stay silent. It turned into fury. Businesses boarded up their windows too late. Flames lit the sky. Sirens wailed from every direction. News anchors struggled to keep up with the chaos. The footage that had once shown a brutal beating was now followed by new images: buildings on fire, helicopters circling smoke, citizens crying, looting, running. And yet, amid the destruction, the message was clear. We saw the truth, and they still got away with it. For days, the city burned. Nearly every major street bore the marks of rage and despair. But this wasn't mindless violence. It was a response to generational trauma. 2 years of being told that justice was equal, only to watch that lie unravel in real time. To realize that even when you follow the rules, when the truth is recorded, when the evidence is undeniable, your pain can still be dismissed. National figures weighed in. Some condemned the unrest. Others understood it. A few dared to act. Why were people more outraged by broken windows than broken bones? Why did property damage draw more media attention than a man nearly beaten to death? The man at the center of it all, Rodney, remained mostly quiet. While cities debated his name, his character, and his past, he was in recovery. Physically, his wounds would heal, but mentally, emotionally, the scar was deep. He hadn't asked to be a symbol. He hadn't asked for his pain to be political. But there he was, everywhere. For a moment, it seemed like the story might end there. A brutal beating, a viral video, a courtroom loss, a national riot. Just another cycle of injustice. But something else was happening behind the scenes. Something the public didn't see coming. Federal authorities were watching. And while the state had failed to deliver justice, the Department of Justice wasn't ready to walk away. Behind closed doors, a new investigation was forming, one that wouldn't rely on local politics or friendly juries. One that would look at civil rights, constitutional violations, and systemic abuse of power. One that might turn the story around. Because sometimes, when the truth gets ignored at the front door of justice, it finds another way in through the back. The nation watched in disbelief. The verdict was final. Not guilty. 4 officers, free to walk. The tape had shown everything, or so the public believed. The baton strikes, the pain, the silence of a man who never struck back. But the jury didn't see it that way. They were told to focus on the officer's perspective. To consider the adrenaline, the supposed danger, the possibility of resistance that wasn't captured on camera. The defense had played the slow-motion footage over and over, asking what would you do in that split second. They made the violence feel clinical, even reasonable, but what played out in the courtroom felt disconnected from what millions had seen with their own eyes. That was the first rupture, a moment when Americans realized the justice system could process the truth and still come out with the wrong answer. In the days that followed, silence didn't hold. It cracked, and then it collapsed. Protesters gathered in city squares. Some held signs reading, "No justice, no peace." Others just stood in stunned quiet, holding up pictures of the man who had become a symbol of racial injustice. What started as peaceful protests swelled with tension. In some neighborhoods, frustration spilled over. Storefronts shattered. Police lines formed. Rubber bullets flew. Helicopters hovered low. The media zoomed in on burning buildings and looters, but missed the context: years of abuse, discrimination, and being ignored. The public outrage wasn't just about one man. It was about every man who'd been stopped for driving while black. Every woman followed around a store. Every family afraid to call the police in their own neighborhood. The government urged calm, but their tone rang hollow. "Stay peaceful," they said, as if people hadn't already tried that, as if marches hadn't already been ignored, as if videos hadn't already been dismissed. Meanwhile, major cities across the country went on high alert. Police departments increased surveillance. Civil liberties organizations called emergency meetings. Social media, still in its early days, buzzed with raw anger and unfiltered truths. The phrase systemic racism began to surface in the mainstream, and Americans were suddenly having difficult conversations around the dinner table that had been avoided for generations. Inside police departments, the mood was defensive. Officers closed ranks. Union leaders gave press conferences about supporting law enforcement under attack. Some claimed the officers had been victims of media distortion. Others said the riots were proof that tough policing was necessary. It was the classic blue wall of silence loyalty over accountability. Even officers who privately admitted the video was hard to watch refused to speak out publicly. They feared backlash, suspension, or worse, being labeled a traitor. But behind the scenes, cracks were forming. Younger officers started questioning the culture. Whistleblowers contacted advocacy groups anonymously. A few brave individuals stepped forward, sharing stories of excessive force, racial profiling, and the internal pressure to stay in line. For the first time in decades, the public had leverage. They had the footage. They had the numbers. They had the moral ground. And now, they had whispers coming from inside the system itself. This created a ripple effect. Cities began considering civilian oversight boards. Academics published research about racial disparities in policing. Legislators floated new bills targeting police reform. It wasn't enough, not yet, but it was momentum. For once, the outrage wasn't fading after a few news cycles. It was growing louder, stronger, more focused. Then came the twist no one saw coming, at least not that soon. The Department of Justice quietly opened a civil rights investigation. While local courts had failed to secure justice, federal investigators were not bound by the same standards. They weren't looking at assault anymore. They were examining whether constitutional rights had been violated, specifically the right to be free from unreasonable force and unlawful treatment under color of law. The announcement made headlines: federal oversight, a rare move, and to many, a final hope. The officers previously cleared by a local jury were now at risk of federal charges. The mood shifted again. This wasn't just about one city anymore. It was about national accountability. Could the same system that failed finally police itself? The federal probe was quiet but thorough. Witnesses were re-interviewed. The full tape was analyzed again, not just for what it showed, but for what it proved under the Constitution. Medical reports, radio dispatches, and training manuals were all pulled into evidence. And as the case built strength, public pressure returned with new fire. Activists called for justice, not revenge, for a verdict that reflected reality, not politics. For the first time, it seemed like those in power were actually listening. When news broke that 2 of the officers would face federal charges, reactions were swift. Some cheered, others scoffed, saying the government was just saving face. But deep down, many felt something unfamiliar possibility. That maybe this time, accountability wasn't just a word on a protest sign. Maybe it was a real door, slowly creaking open. And as the case moved forward, Americans waited. Not with blind optimism, but with sharpened eyes. They knew what was at stake. They knew this was more than one case. More than one man. It was a test. Could a government that once failed a black man on the street now defend him in federal court? could a nation haunted by injustice finally face itself in the mirror. The climax wasn't about fire or fury. It was about whether the truth filmed, felt, and fought for would finally be enough to move the scales of justice. The courtroom was different this time, not just in location, but in tone, in pressure, in purpose. This wasn't a state trial anymore. The stakes weren't about policy violations or departmental procedures. This was about the Constitution, about civil rights, about whether a man's humanity could be stripped away by a badge and baton, and whether the federal government had the courage to call it what it was, a violation of law, not just a lapse in judgment. No media frenzy, no camera crews flooding the steps. The Department of Justice moved deliberately, quietly, but with unmistakable force. It wasn't just seeking punishment. It was sending a message. The charges were clear: deprivation of rights under color of law. The language might sound technical, but its meaning cut deep. It accused two of the officers of using their power to beat a man into silence, to treat him as subhuman, and to get away with it because they wore the uniform. The prosecution didn't rehash the same narrative. They didn't just play the tape again. They reframed the case around one central question. When an officer breaks the law, who polices them? The answer, this time, would not be left to a jury of sympathetic neighbors or a courtroom stacked with doubt. The evidence was meticulous medical reports, expert testimony, and most importantly, the tape itself, uncut, in real time. There were no slow-motion distractions, no attempts to distort what every viewer could feel in their gut. The prosecutor didn't shout. He didn't need to. He simply let the footage speak, then followed it with federal law, with precedent, with logic that couldn't be ignored. He didn't argue for emotion. He demanded recognition of rights that were trampled with every strike of that baton. The defense, again, leaned on fear. They talked about chaos, unpredictability, adrenaline, about how officers had seconds to make decisions. They tried to paint the victim as aggressive, unstable, even dangerous, though the footage and testimony proved otherwise. But this wasn't a state court anymore. The judge wasn't having it. Each time they tried to inject character attacks or distract from the issue, the court steered them back. What rights were violated? And did these officers knowingly do it? And then came the turning point, the response that changed everything. A witness took the stand. He was a former officer from the same department. Still young, still on the force at the time of the beating. He spoke with visible discomfort but didn't flinch. He testified that during roll calls, officers often joked about tuning people up, slang for giving someone a lesson with fists or batons. He admitted there was a silent culture, one where excessive force wasn't just overlooked, it was expected in certain neighborhoods. And that, on the night in question, after the beating, one officer laughed and said, "Bet he won't run next time." That silence in the courtroom wasn't shock. It was recognition. Recognition that this wasn't a one-off incident. It was part of a pattern, one long protected by badges and silence and spin. That testimony didn't just reinforce the charges. It cracked the foundation beneath them. The jury deliberated for days. The country waited. Again. But this time, there was a different energy, more cautious, more bitter, but more aware. When the verdict was read guilty on both counts for the two main officers, the air shifted. No cheering, no celebration, just a quiet exhale. Not because justice had fully arrived, but because for once it hadn't been denied. They were sentenced to 30 months in federal prison. Critics said it wasn't enough. The time didn't match the damage. But for millions of Americans, it wasn't just about the length of the sentence. It was about the validation of truth, about the fact that a federal courtroom had done what the state could not call brutality by its name and deliver legal consequences for the abuse of authority. That verdict became a national inflection point. Civil rights leaders pointed to it as evidence that federal oversight was not just symbolic, it was essential. Advocacy groups gained ground, pushing for the expansion of independent investigations into police misconduct. The words federal civil rights investigation became a necessary threat, an assurance that if local systems failed, there was still a mechanism for accountability. But the response wasn't just in courtrooms. It bled into legislation. States began reconsidering how force was defined. Cities created inspector general offices. Use of force policies were rewritten. Some departments finally banned chokeholds. Training began to include implicit bias, trauma-informed policing, de-escalation, not as optional, but as required. The ripple effect wasn't instant, and it wasn't universal. But it started. In schools and universities, the story of that night was added to the curriculum, not just as a legal case, but as a lesson in power, race, and systemic failure. Students debated what should have happened, how systems could be rebuilt, and why a camcorder held more power than sworn testimony. Filmmakers created documentaries. Journalists launched deep investigations into similar cases, and every time another incident surfaced, this case was cited, not just as history, but as precedent. But perhaps the most important response came from everyday citizens. People who used to stay silent began to speak up. By the thousands, they pulled out their phones when they saw injustice. They joined local accountability boards. They organized, educated, and redefined what civic duty meant. Because now they knew what happened in one neighborhood could shake a nation, and what got ignored in one courtroom could be reversed in another. This twist wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about bringing down officers. It was about reaffirming that no one, not even those who carry guns and badges, is above the law. It was about civil rights being more than a slogan, about justice not being a coin toss. In the end, the man who'd once lain broken on that concrete didn't win millions in a courtroom. He didn't become a celebrity or a leader. But his suffering wasn't invisible. It sparked a legal shift, a cultural reckoning, and most importantly, a truth that could no longer be denied. Because the system had tried to bury it. The courtroom had tried to excuse it. The officers had tried to erase it. But the footage lived. The voices rose. And the people refused to forget. Years passed. The headlines faded. The streets slowly quieted. But for those who lived through it, those who watched that video, who stood in protest, who waited breathlessly for justice that almost didn't come, the story never really ended. Because what happened that night wasn't just about one man being beaten. It was about who gets believed, who gets protected, and who gets punished. The man at the center of it all. Rodney never asked to be a symbol. He never wanted the weight of a nation's rage placed on his shoulders. He simply wanted to live, to drive home in peace, to be seen as human. But America has a long history of turning black pain into spectacle and black survival into politics. He became a name everyone knew, not because of who he was, but because of what was done to him. After the federal trial, Rodney received a settlement. It was substantial, but money doesn't erase trauma. His physical injuries healed slowly, but the emotional damage lingered. Chronic anxiety, nightmares, depression. He struggled with addiction, with relationships, with being seen in public. People would stop him and say, "You changed the world," but rarely ask how he was holding up. He died years later in his own backyard. Some say it was an accident. Others say it was heartbreak that never stopped hurting. But his legacy lived on in courtrooms, classrooms, and conversations that would have never happened without him. He was the catalyst for body-worn camera mandates, for national discussions on use of force policies, for federal legislation aimed at curbing police misconduct. Civil rights advocates invoked his name when pushing for reform. His story became part of the legal canon, taught in law schools as a defining moment in modern American justice. Not because justice was served perfectly, but because it was pursued relentlessly. What his case revealed is that justice in America is not automatic. It doesn't flow freely. It must be fought for over and over by people who believe in truth more than comfort, by communities who are tired of being told to wait, by lawyers who won't back down, by everyday citizens who dare to record what others try to erase, and most of all, by those who carry the pain of injustice but still choose to speak, to march, to demand better. This isn't just a story about police brutality. It's a story about accountability, about what happens when institutions are forced to look in the mirror. It's about the power of visual evidence, of federal oversight, of civil rights litigation as a tool not just for compensation, but for change. And it's a reminder that even when the system tries to look away, the people can still hold it accountable. Rodney King once stood at a podium, voice shaking, and asked, "Can we all get along?" It wasn't a political statement. It was a human one, a plea for decency, for peace, for dignity, and it echoed louder than any speech that followed. So what do we take from this? Maybe it's that justice won't come unless we demand it. Maybe it's that no officer, no department, no courtroom should ever be above the rights guaranteed to us all. Or maybe it's that, sometimes, it takes a camcorder, a trial, a riot, and a nation's heartbreak to move the needle just 1 inch forward. But we move forward. That's the point. Rodney's story is proof that when truth is recorded, when voices rise, when justice is challenged, not just in the streets, but in the courts, it can't be ignored forever. The system may resist, delay, deny, but the people will keep showing up, and that is where real justice begins.